Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Pond's mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman. And together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You'll find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle.com on Blue Sky. Hello and welcome to episode 57. Today we begin our long-awaited journey into The Lost World, Conan Doyle's celebrated adventure novel which introduced Professor George Edward Challenger to the reading public. And here's Paul to introduce the first part of the story.
Edward Dunn Malone is a lowly young journalist at the Daily Gazette, whose heart's desire is to win the hand of the beautiful but exacting Gladys Hungerton. She, however, finds Malone lacking in ambition and the requisite spirit of manly competitiveness. She will only bow before another Burton or Stanley, and Malone must venture into the world to discover and conquer before she will consider his approaches. Luckily, his editor, McArdle, gives him the ideal opportunity by introducing him to the irascible, combative, and press-hating Professor George Challenger, who claims to have found evidence of the continued existence of prehistoric life in South America. Upon first approaching Challenger, Malone is thrown down the professor's stairs. Then, in a surprising turn of events, he is given the opportunity to join a new expedition to the Amazon to prove or refute Challenger's outlandish assertions.
Now, the origins of The Lost World are somewhat tangled, but unusually we have a statement from Conan Doyle about its creation. In 1930, shortly after the author passed away, his Strand editor, Herbert Greenhouse Smith, revealed that one of the advertisements for The Lost World had been written by Conan Doyle himself, and it gave this version of events. A friend had been discussing with the author as to the possibility of opening up a new type of story of action. He contended that the possibilities had been exhausted and that with the pirate ship, the treasure hunt, and the other well-known forms of adventure books, no new thrill was possible. The novelist, on the contrary, upheld the view that there was a large field which had not yet been worked, and that it should develop upon the lines of a combination of imagination and realism, each pushed as far as the writer's capacity would carry him. The argument ended in a small bet and a promise by Sir Arthur that he would endeavour to vindicate his opinion by producing such a book. The result is The Lost World. So while that's likely a fair description of at least the spark that ignited the writing of the novel, the story had been dormant in Conan Doyle's mind for a lot longer than that. The first indication that he was thinking of writing the story that would become The Lost World may come as early as January 1889, when he told his mother that he was thinking of a Rider Haggard kind of book called The Inca's Eye, dedicated to all the naughty boys of the empire by one who sympathizes with them. But it was around 1909, 1910 that several strands of influence began to converge for Conan Doyle. The first was his newfound interest in paleontology. Having moved to Crowborough in 1907, he'd learned of local fossil finds nearby, and indeed had casts made of two large iguanodon fossils, which were displayed in his home. According to St. John Adcock, who interviewed Conan Doyle for The Bookman, it was discovery of these relics that put his mind to the story. The second influence came from further afield. In 1909, Conan Doyle was enlisted to write The Crimes of the Congo, about the atrocities taking place in the Belgian Congo, then the private fiefdom of King Leopold. He was spurred to action by E.D. Morel, who'd founded the Congo Reform Association, and through Morel he met Roger Casement, both of whom would influence characters in the story. In fact, in August 1910, Conan Doyle told Roger Casement of his idea for a sort of wild boys book and asked him to look out for anything weird and strange on his travels through South America. The third influence was a topical interest in exploration. Conan Doyle had obviously taste for exploration himself. In 1880, he had been a ship surgeon aboard the whaling ship the Hope. And in 1885, he'd attended a lecture by a British botanist who'd visited Venezuela and was the first Westerner to reach the summit of the isolated, flat-topped Mount Roraima, which is referenced in the story. And in 1909, he also read of the exploration of the Ricardo Franco Hills in Brazil by a British Lieutenant Colonel, P.H. Fawcett. Another explorer of note was Commander Robert Edwin Peary, who voyaged to the North Pole in 1909. Conan Doyle gave a speech at the Royal Societies Club in honour of Peary, which actually reflects some of the themes of The Lost World. Conan Doyle pretended that he had a grievance against explorers and said, "There had been a time when the world was full of blank spaces and in which a man of imagination might be able to give free scope to his fancy, but owing to the ill-directed energy of their guest and other gentlemen of similar tendencies, these spaces were rapidly being filled up, and the question was where the romance writer was to turn." So all these influences were circulating around 1909, 1910. The first draft of The Lost World was then written on the inside of an archaeological journal, no less, in October and November 1911, and it was completed by the 3rd of December, at which point Conan Doyle turned his attention to creating photographs and artifacts to accompany the text. The story was then serialized in the Strand magazine between April and November 1912. The first UK edition came out in October of the same year, just as the serialization was finishing. And such was Conan Doyle's enthusiasm and fondness for the book that he already had an idea for a sequel before it had finished its appearance in the Strand. And finally, there's a very good annotated edition of The Lost World that came out from Wessex Press in 1996, edited by Roy Pilot and Alvin Roden, and also a manuscript reproduction from SP Books, which came out in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating to look into the long gestation period, really, of this novel, and particularly to pick up on this early idea for a novel called The Inca's Eye.
Yes.
Which he was planning in 1889, and obviously thinking of South America, which is an interesting pointer. Now, the dating 1889 there, you're coming on the back of King Solomon's Mines by Haggard, and Haggard had actually written King Solomon's Mines as a kind of answer to Treasure Island.
Yes,
because he enjoyed Treasure Island. But so you thought, well, I can go one better. And again, it's interesting, part of what inspired Haggard was the fact that Treasure Island had a map at the beginning, and Haggard was taken with this idea. And King Solomon's Mines actually comes with a fold-out map, or fold-out piece of parchment with the map and the original instructions. And, so Doyle's very much going along these lines. He's been inspired. I mean, obviously Haggard and Stevenson play their role in Doyle's own work, but it's pertinent, I think, to point to the dedication which opens The Lost World, which is, "I have wrought my simple plan, if I give an hour of joy to the boy who's half a man, or the man who's half a boy." Already showing that the multi-layered nature of the book is actually laid out very well in that, as well as it being a piece of fun. But it's also, I feel it's tipping his hat to Rider Haggard, because Rider Haggard dedicated, or his dedication to King Solomon's Mines, which originally came out in 1885, was, "This faithful but unpretending record of a remarkable adventure is hereby respectfully dedicated by the narrator, Alan Quatermain, to all the big and little boys who read it." So
yes, indeed.
You're in the same sort of territory straight away there. And, with what Doyle was saying to all the naughty boys of the Empire, with The Inca's Eye, it's all playing with the same material. When Doyle says in that letter to his mother in 1889, but calling The Inca's Eye a Rider Haggardy adventure, and you do feel with The Lost World he wants to out Rider Haggard.
Oh, that's definitely true. And in fact, that letter goes on and says, he gives a bit of a sense of what the Inca's eye might be
Mm.
about to his mother. He says, "The notable experiences of John H. Calder, Ivan Boscovich, Jim Horscroft, and Major General Pengethley Jones in their search after the Inca's eye. How's that for an appetite whetter?" Which
Yes.
just sounds like Quatermain and his
Yeah.
gang.
Wish he'd written that as well.
Yeah, true.
And note that in those names, note that John H.
Yes,
That's
indeed.
interesting. And also, Pengethley Jones?
Pengethley Jones, yeah.
Whoa, is he a relative of Indiana, we wonder? Along those lines. But yeah, it's Rider Haggard's definitely in the air around this. And it's perhaps worth noting as well, 2 years before The Lost World came out, there was Rider Haggard released a novel, Queen Sheba's Ring, which was another one of his African adventures.
Yes.
And there's an eccentric professor character in that called Ptolemy Higgs, who's very loud, bearded, and he's very similar
Yeah.
to a certain George Edward Challenger. So I think it's quite clear that Doyle has read Queen Sheba's Ring and been inspired to some extent with that. And I'm not saying plagiarism. It is
No.
going to be more homage, and perhaps the hope that Rider Haggard would have a chuckle over what all these numerous tips of the hat to him.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's going on here.
Yeah.
Mm,
I think that's fair. And also this ties into a literary phenomenon of that 1880s, 1890s period, which is now sort of termed the Victorian quest romance. And so the people that you've already mentioned, Stevenson and Rider Haggard, we can throw Kipling into there as
mm,
well, and The Lost World, they all sort of conform to this idea, the Victorian quest romance being this kind of, it's typically an all-male party, they're in pursuit of some goal in the far-flung part of the world, typically filling in the blank spaces on the
mm,
map. They have to abide by a chivalric code,
mm,
and they often encounter sort of degeneration or evolutionary threats. And I think that it's one of those things where the journey is as important as the destination, because they sort of learn something about themselves along the way, which is a
mm,
very kind of standard trope. And, you can go all the way back to Jason and the Argonauts and the Odyssey and things like that for these kind of storytelling. But definitely with, the Quatermain stories, Treasure Island fits into
mm,
this, as you've said,
mm.
even, The Man Who Would Be King, Jungle Book, Kim, they all have elements of this kind of story in there as well.
And the other thread these stories so often have as well is the coming of age.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean you've got this in Micah Clarke, you've got it in the White Company, you've got it here with Malone.
Yes.
And what's going on in this, I feel, with The Lost World, here we've got a middle-aged Conan Doyle looking back and kind of reworking some of his own ideas and his own experiences, and there's always going to be elements of regret, or what if I'd taken this path. I think this is what's going on with a lot of the Gladys issue, which we'll discuss later.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be that element is a very important element to quest stories.
Yes. Thinking about this as a literary phenomenon, there's been quite a lot of analysis as to why it came out in the 1880s, and it's particularly relevant to scholars of Conan Doyle because a lot of it seems to be around changes in appetite and taste and the way that publishing was conducted. So, the death of the triple-decker novel. There is one interpretation in particular, Elaine Showalter was talking about how, the triple-decker novel, which at that time was maybe focusing more on social and domestic issues, was the sort of domain of the female author, George Eliot being probably the classic who was most commonly associated with this. But actually, that you can see in the Victorian quest romance a very male narrative starting to come in and take over and replace. And her interpretation is that this is a kind of men reclaiming the English novel. But you've also got other themes. Edward Said talked about, a sense of imperial crisis and the ideas of imperial success and superiority over inferior races, all of which kind of circles Victorian quest romance. But I think one of the things that we'll see in this story in The Lost World is that The Lost World is a very late example of the Victorian quest romance. It's 1912
Mm.
that this is coming out. And so it's not only part of the tradition, it's at the tail end looking back at that tradition. And so I think it's more playful with the concept in the way that you're talking about, Rider Haggard tipping the hat to
Mm.
Rider Haggard. There's a knowingness in this. And it's one of the joys, I think, of The Lost World, and also one of the difficulties, that it defies simplification as a novel. You can't read it purely as a boy's own adventure because there are so many layers to it. I mean,
Mm.
you can enjoy it as a boy's own adventure, particularly as a boy, as
Mm.
I did reading it,
Mm.
age 12. But you come back to it now, and there are so many different layers and levels to it.
Mm. And they're also, I think, tinged with regret and melancholy.
Yeah.
A lot of these stories, and partly it is the whole thing that Doyle is joking about with Peary,
Yes.
about the lost spaces or the undiscovered spaces vanishing more and more. He almost seems to be saying the real life explorers are taking away from the fictioneers. I would argue the other way. I'd say, well, to the fiction writer, there's still plenty of this left to go up because they can just make stuff up to begin with. But there is that element of regret, and also the regret, late over actions carried out maybe, and just this kind of the regret over, in the real world, the loss of this kind of adventure.
Yeah.
Is these there's less and less of these, the Burtons and the Speaks and the Stanleys, all of whom you can certainly see have their very, very negative sides,
Yes.
as well, and that comes in here as well. So it is, as I said, there's a great mix, and it's too easy to generalise. And write, Doyle and Haggard. It's easy to write them off as but there's. I think Doyle, dare I say this, is probably the better writer at this sort of material. But Haggard is obviously a master of it. But Haggard I think his novels get more and more melancholic.
Yes, they do.
And you also with his novels following almost the life cycle of Alan Quatermain, so they've got a linking theme there. So there's loads of stuff going on under this kind of glossy, fun surface.
And your point there about, where does the writer of imagination go? It ties into another theme about, I think, Victorian quest romance more broadly, is that it comes about around the same time as the emergence of what we would see today as kind of modern science fiction. Science fiction obviously goes way back to, you can go back to Swift, but Verne. Journey to the Center of the Earth is a big influence on this. That's 1864. But interestingly, this is coming out right at that kind of tipping point. So we have The Island of Dr. Moreau from Wells in 96. You've got War of the Worlds in 97. You have, in particular, I think The First Men on the Moon, 1901, is a really important one. And each of these stories are playing with the same themes I mentioned in the quest romance, but in science fiction setting. There's degeneration in the time machine with the Morlocks, and the term science fiction is not going to be coined until 1929. But many of those kind of things around exploring the fringes of scientific possibility are things that Conan Doyle himself has written about in the past as well. Things like Great Kindplatz Experiment we've talked about, or when we did Horror of the Heights, which is later, one of the precursors of the Brown Paracord motor, and one that I'm sure we'll come back to again, Blue John Gap, you could arguably suggest is in that tradition as well. So it's a really interesting time where you can feel that there is an argument being made about having more imaginative fiction, almost as a kind of antidote to the social dramas that have been in these triple deckers. And that's where another person who's interesting in connection with Stevenson and Haggard and Kipling and Doyle is Andrew Lang. And Andrew Lang was writing, essentially treatises arguing for exactly this, that there is a new domain of imaginative fiction that is to open up. And it's fascinating what you say, Paul, about Haggard was influenced by the map in Treasure Island, because that business about having artifacts or having things that will add to the reality of these great fictional quest stories is something that I think we don't really talk enough about when it comes to the Lost World, because I think Conan Doyle really does a quite amazing job of creating a very immersive and what we might call today a multimedia
Mm.
novel, in the sense that it's loaded with faked photographs, drawings, maps that are all intended to give that illusion to the story. And he wasn't original in this. You mentioned Treasure Island, but things like Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket by Poe is meant to be pieced together from different sources. She is told by
Yeah.
an editor who's piecing together Holly's manuscript, aren't they?
Mm.
So you get that sense of it.
Haggard was very strong on the. Again, I think Haggard's really leading the way in the sort of stuff that Doyle is then going to take it to the next level.
Yeah, that's right. And the verisimilitude really comes in even in the subtitle of the novel, being an account of the recent amazing adventures of Professor George E. Challenger, Lord John Roxton, Professor Summerlee, and Mr. E.D. Malone of the Daily Gazette. And then straight into something else which gives a sense of the reality. Mr. E.D. Malone desires to state that both the injunction for restraint and the libel action have been withdrawn unreservedly by Professor G.E. Challenger, who, being satisfied that no criticism or comment in this book is meant in an offensive spirit, has guaranteed that he will place no impediment to its publication and circulation. So even before we've met Challenger, he's being set up as a difficult sort. And then you get into all these photographs and illustrations. And Conan Doyle himself in Memories and Adventures describes what happened. He says, in rather an impish mood, I set myself to make the pictures realistic. I and two friends made ourselves up to resemble the members of the mythical exploring party, and were photographed at a table spread with globes and instruments. I was made up by Clarkson to resemble Challenger, and the disguises were on the whole very adequate. I also made two faked photographs of the plateau, and altogether the pictures of the book were quite unique. And the two friends that he refers to there are the illustrator Patrick Forbes, who was actually his brother-in-law. He was his wife's sister's husband, and Forbes' friend, the photographer William H. Ransford. And both of those get a reference in Malone's foreword as well. So Malone says, Mr. E.D. Malone would also wish to express his gratitude to Mr. Patrick L. Forbes of Roslyn Hill, Hampstead, for the skill and sympathy with which he has worked up the sketches which were brought from South America, and also to Mr. W. Ransford of Elm Row, Hampstead, for his valuable expert help in dealing with the photographs. So you get straight from the outset this very, very playful idea of using all of these artifacts to create more of a sense of reality. And Conan Doyle's clearly having fun with this. He goes on to say in Memories and Adventures, on him being dressed up as Challenger, I had an amusing morning touring London in a cab and calling upon one or two friends in the character of their lost uncle from Borneo.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole element of again, it's the multi-layered nature of this book, that there is an element that the whole thing is one huge joke. But of course, it goes far deeper than that. But that is from so many of these ideas and clues. There is this sense of Doyle having great fun doing almost the practical joking side, which you've just mentioned, and then all the literary in jokes, and again, this is where the Haggard stuff comes in as well. It's just loaded with these things, but you can enjoy if you know the joke. But if you don't know the joke, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And he continued to have a joke with this for quite a long time, really. I mean, when they were making the 1925 silent movie version of The Lost World with Maurice Beery as Challenger, Conan Doyle had attended the dinner of the American Club of Magicians in New York and showed footage of dinosaurs without explanation, which of course was the test footage from Willis O'Brien's stop motion animations for the film, some 3 years before the film actually came out. But he declined to explain the photograph. So he definitely has this sense of impish humor with this. But also it's bizarre to think that 10 years later he would be accused of faking photographs himself and being involved in a deception around the Cottingley fairies. So there's very weird sort of premonition of events to come with a lot of this stuff that he's toying around with too.
And on that occasion, he sees very little to laugh about.
Yes, he's lost his sense of humour in the 10 years in between, I think.
I think it's also worth mentioning with this that Conan Doyle clearly, he did have a love of dress up.
Yes.
I mean, there's the the famous photograph of him dressed as a Viking for a party, and I think despite his protestations to the contrary, things like dressing up as the deputy lieutenant of Sussex, he enjoyed
Yes.
that side of things. And then there's the story of the Christmas was when his daughter Mary was young and he dressed up as some sort of monster goblin and terrified her and had to spend Christmas calming her down.
Well, I think you said before as well that this probably makes Conan Doyle the world's first cosplayer.
Yes.
He's actually playing his own character here. So let's get into the actual story itself. And our first chapter is there are heroisms all around us. It sets up Malone, our feisty journalist for the Daily Gazette, is on the verge of proposing marriage to Gladys, who royally shuns his advances as she seeks a gentleman more in the mould of Stanley or Burton.
Yeah, it's another one of the oddities of this book is this ready label of boy's own adventure, and it begins in this domestic scene with Malone, kind of doing what the Victorians would call poodle faking over Gladys, and it's the kind of thing that that boys reading it will straight away go, yuck.
Yeah.
What's going on here? I'm not interested in this, but and obviously there's a lot of humour going on here that again for the more adult readers. But it's also quite surprising. You're looking forward to themes in the book, of course, but when Malone talks about Gladys, how beautiful she was, and yet how aloof. We had been friends, quite good friends, but never could I get beyond the same comradeship which I might have established with one of my fellow reporters upon the Gazette. Perfectly frank, perfectly kindly, and perfectly unsexual. My instincts are all against a woman being too frank and at her ease with me. It is no compliment to a man. Where the real sex feeling begins, timidity and distrust are its companions, heritage from old wicked days, when love and violence went often hand in hand. So there's a lot in there,
isn't there?
And it's obviously pointing the way to this adventure that Malone's going to be going on and going into the world of the primitive. But again, some of his attitudes here are quite shocking, really, and out of touch. And again, you wonder, is this Doyle having another swipe at the new woman?
Yes.
Or is he having a swipe at Malone for his antediluvian attitudes? But it's a real mix of things, and then that mentioning twice there in the paragraph of sex in a boy's own adventure.
Yeah.
It kind of makes you sit up a bit, and it's a surprise.
Yeah.
If you read the book for the first time as an adult, or you're returning to it the first time as an adult, I don't remember that bit.
Yeah.
But it is pointing out, here's one of the big themes of this novel, alongside the let's go hunting dinosaurs. You've got what's really going on here, and what it's really going to be about, which is about scientific attitudes and what are we as a race.
Yeah.
Are we advancing, or Malone is obviously there's part of him that's that's not advanced
yes.
in his attitudes, but then you could say she is as well, because she's demanding that he be a caveman.
Well, that's right. She's not presented in an entirely in an
Mm,
entirely positive light here,
mm.
and we'll come back to exactly what happens to Gladys later.
And it also, I mean, as we progress with this, and he's getting frustrated and almost, "Well, what do you want of me?"
Yeah,
To Gladys, and we have this strange exchange. "Just say the word. Teetotal, aeronaut, theosophist, Superman. I'll have a try at it, Gladys, if you will only give me an idea of what would please you." That list itself is very of its time,
yeah,
and of, you know, Doyle's concerns. Theosophist.
yeah,
Who would come up with that one?
yes, that's
Um,
right.
Superman suggests that he's been interested in having a look at Nietzsche's work.
Nietzsche. Mm,
The teetotal, very interesting with Doyle's own background, with the alcoholism of his father and so on. Aeronaut, and he's just had a go at being an aeronaut.
yes,
I'm right in saying it. So, and we've got the horror of the heights
yeah,
as part of that. But it's fascinating what's going on
yeah.
straight at the outset of this book.
Yeah, it does, and that's why I think it's one of those books that rewards rereading
Mm,
because you get different things from it each time.
mm.
And it's worth saying as well, this is our first encounter with Edward Dunn Malone, and that name has some obvious resonances.
Yes, I mean, you've already mentioned these other names of friends and relatives who've helped Conan Doyle with the kind of some of the technical aspects of the project.
Mm,
But E.D. Malone is obviously a reflection of E.D. Morel,
yeah,
the journalist who'd been at the centre of the Congo story, that had been occupying Conan Doyle over the past few years. The ironically named Free State of the Congo, which
yeah,
was
yeah,
King Leopold II's own playground, essentially, for the rubber plantations, his own private bank. And E.D. Morel he'd worked for a shipping company with connections to Africa,
yeah,
and then he'd started, or to the Congo, I should say, and he'd started to, what was going on sickened him. And so he was the one who began to alert the world,
yeah,
and eventually, through the man who would become his colleague, who we'll talk about shortly, Sir Roger Casement.
yeah,
They raised a storm
yeah,
around this issue, and ended up recruiting Conan Doyle. And Doyle, his admiration for Morel,
mm,
one of his the ways he made this obvious was by calling this heroic character, as he'll become, E.D. Malone.
Edith Malone.
It's a straight tribute.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely
Mm,
right. Yeah.
mm,
So we then Malone heads back to his editor McArdle, and McArdle suggests that he talk to this modern Munchausen, the
mm,
zoologist Professor Challenger, who frankly McArdle wants to expose as a fraud. There's a little a reference to the Strand and to Nunes in this whole
mm,
sequence because you get McArdle, who's the editor, who'd be the sort of Greenhouse Smith character, but also behind Greenhouse Smith was the publisher. And here again, Malone has got a publisher called Beaumont. And Malone says, of course, Beaumont was the real boss, but he
mm.
lived in the rarefied atmosphere of some Olympian height from which he could distinguish nothing smaller than an international crisis or a split in the cabinet. And here we get McArdle giving the famous phrase, the big blank spaces in the
Mm.
map are all being filled in and there's no room for romance anywhere, which is the lament of the story and is lifted directly from that speech I was talking about earlier that Conan Doyle was giving in honor of Peary.
Mm, mm. So it's through McArdle, Malone's editor, that we get our first idea of Professor Challenger, and
Mm.
obviously McArdle has a low opinion of Challenger, but partly probably because he knows that Challenger hates the press.
Yes.
So it's a kind of hate relationship on both sides there, and we get some idea of an almost who's who entry on Challenger, and it's notable perhaps that McArdle is very Scottish.
Yes.
We're given a very Scottish character, and notably he has another red-haired Conan Doyle character there.
Mm.
But we get this background to Challenger, and it's Challenger George Edward, born Largs, NB, presumably North Britain,
Hmm.
1863, educated Largs Academy, Edinburgh University. So we've got Challenger as a very Scottish character, which seldom comes out
No,
in adaptations or discussions of this novel.
no, it's true.
We give McArdle has a very, very broad Scots accent,
Yes.
and Challenger doesn't.
Yeah.
Challenger is always depicted as a very English character. Even his arrogance
Mm.
is kind of almost very, very English, and his presumptions.
Yes.
So it is quite fascinating to go back to this and suddenly realise, yeah, we're talking about a Scottish character here. This is again Conan Doyle's background
Yeah.
coming out, and we've already talked about with the photographs. There's a degree of self-identification
Yeah.
with Challenger on Conan Doyle's part. So here we get him as a Scottish character, and Doyle was from Edinburgh in the east. Challenger is Largs in the
In the
west
West.
of Scotland, but nevertheless, Challenger also goes to Edinburgh University. So he'll be behind Doyle because he's 1863, so he's 4 years younger than Doyle.
Yes.
And it will be interesting to think if the young Challenger encountered some of the professors
Yes.
that Doyle had been taught by, and were to influence Challenger himself. And then going through the rest of his career, where he has worked at in the British Museum, assistant keeper of comparative anthropology. But that resigned after acrimonious correspondence same year. So we're already getting his character here.
Yeah.
He's a man who's got a good solid background, but not such or his character isn't as reliable in an establishment kind of way. It's
Yeah.
a
That's
solid
right.
character, but in the wrong sort of way for the establishment. So he rubs people up the wrong way. So we're already getting that, but this is the sort of character who's going to appeal to Doyle. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is also an establishment character who's essentially
Yes,
anti-establishment,
that's right.
and Challenger is the same here. And
Yeah.
these are sort of characters that Doyle admires. So we're getting set up straight away for a lot of fun with
We
Challenger.
are. We are. And we also get set up in here a little nod to his views, because it says in that same biog that he has written numerous papers, including the underlying fallacy of Weissmanism, which caused heated discussion at the Zoological Congress of Vienna. And Weissman had written a really important work called On Heredity in 1883, which is a kind of fundamentalist survival of the fittest view, which rejected this idea that species could develop traits and then pass them on genetically to subsequent generations. And I think the issue there that's particularly important is that Weissman admitted the idea that evolution could go backwards. We could regress as well as go forwards as well. And maybe that is the thing that Challenger in particular is objecting to. And that's going to become a theme, particularly when we get into the latter stages of the book. The other thing that happens in this chapter is that Malone seeks a second opinion, and so he consults the fantastically named Tarp Henry, who is on the staff of Nature, about Challenger. Actually, he goes to meet him at the Savage Club, which itself is an interesting choice, because the Savage Club was Andrew Lang was a major figure in the Savage Club. Rider Haggard was a member. Kipling was a member. Stevenson was a country member from Samoa, but I don't think Conan Doyle was a member of the Savage Club. I don't think he was.
I don't. No, I think you're right on that.
Yeah,
You would think he would be.
you would, wouldn't you? But it's a kind of all of this pool of the same sort of literary people that we've been talking about before are all members of the Savage Club. But I think there's a wonderful description from Tarp Henry here of Challenger. He's as clever as they make him, a full-charge battery of force and vitality, but a quarrelsome, ill-conditioned faddist, and unscrupulous at that. He'd gone the length of faking some photographs over the South American business. So, we haven't even met Challenger, and we've built up this incredible picture of the person that we are going to meet in the next chapter.
And we're also, again, I think this is something we're going to find throughout this and throughout Challenger's career, this reflection of Doyle himself.
Yeah.
Because Doyle will know he's regarded in the same sort of way by a lot of people as having a first-rate brain, but a faddist.
Yeah.
Because he goes from campaign to campaign, idea to idea, so he will have been looked at in the same way, and it's you do feel that this whole identification with Challenger, it is his reply to his critics,
Yes.
and almost his reply in the way that, like Challenger, I don't care what you think.
Yeah, and he
Mm.
also had a great affection for the character of Challenger.
Mm.
Challenger famously is the character that becomes the spiritualist. But
Mm.
I've always thought that if Sherlock Holmes is the brain and Gerard is the heart,
Mhm.
you know, Challenger is this mixture of, a great thinker with intemperate character, but he's probably the closest reflection that we have to at least a side of Conan Doyle, I think.
From Doyle's own pen,
Yeah.
and he's basically a force of nature.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm.
So now we're set up for Malone to go and meet this infamous
Hmm.
scientist that we've heard so much about already, and he decides to approach him on Tarpa Henry's advice in the guise of a student. Challenger's letter admitting him to his presence is rather wonderful. You quote an isolated sentence from my lecture and appear to have some difficulty in understanding it. I should have thought that only a subhuman intelligence could have failed to grasp the point. But if it really needs amplification, I shall consent to see you at the hour named, though visits and visitors of every sort are exceedingly distasteful to me. And I think this has got one of the best pieces of descriptive shorthand of anything Conan Doyle ever wrote, where he describes Challenger's handwriting as being like barbed wire railing. And Tarp Henry has this lovely little line saying that there's some new stuff, Cuticura or something, which is better than arnica. So he's wanting him to get his bruise ointment ready. So yes, and then we arrive at the Challenger household where we meet his chauffeur and general factotum Austin and Mrs. Jessie Challenger.
Jessie Challenger is it's one of these classic setups of her being the opposite. Yeah, she's described as a small woman, bright, vivacious, dark-eyed, more French than English in her type. And she's quite feisty in her own way.
Yeah.
And will stand up to her bullying husband. I mean, he does love her, but he likes to think he rules the roost.
Oh, completely.
But she is frightened of him, but she's not frightened to stand up to him. And there's something I just thought reading that with the description, with her strong personality. And the small size. I thought I think this is Doyle again reflecting his mother, Mary, who meant so
good
much to
point.
him, and he makes point throughout a lot of his writing about his mother, about her francophilia. In fact, she could read French. She loved French culture. This kind of French side that's kind of put in there with Jessie Challenger. I think this is a little tribute. On Doyle's part to his mother.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I actually saw a production of The Poisoned Belt a couple of years ago where the part of Professor Challenger's wife was played by a finger puppet, which I thought it was wonderful. Though they were sort of giving the speech as a finger puppet, but it was very good. It was very funny. And then Malone is granted an audience with the great professor, and we get the rather wonderful description.
Yeah, so we get Malone's first impressions this way. His appearance made me gasp. I was prepared for something strange, but not for so overpowering a personality as this. It was his size which took one's breath away, his size and his imposing presence. His head was enormous, the largest I have ever seen upon a human being. I am sure that his top hat, had I ever ventured to don it, would have slipped over me entirely and rested on my shoulders. He had the face and beard which I associate with an Assyrian bull, the former florid, the latter so black as almost to have a suspicion of blue, spade-shaped and rippling down over his chest. The hair was peculiar, plastered down in front in a long curving wisp over his massive forehead. The eyes were blue-grey, under great black tufts, very clear, very critical, and very masterful. A huge spread of shoulders and a chest like a barrel were the other parts of him which appeared above the table, save for two enormous hands covered with long black hair. This and a bellowing, roaring, rumbling voice made up my first impression of the notorious Professor Challenger.
It's such a wonderful description, and and it's obviously not long before Challenger susses that Malone is actually a reporter and throws him out of the house. But I think one of the amazing things about Conan Doyle's writing is that we have had Challenger set up so comprehensively by other voices. You've got this faux forward, which is talking about legal action. You've got McArdle, you've got Tarp Henry's description, and now you meet Challenger for the first time. And it's almost like Conan Doyle setting himself up to fail. You think no character can be as rich and as bizarre as the one that has been hinted at already. And I think it's one of the triumphs of this novel that he goes even one better in the very first encounter with Challenger. He's such a good character. And it's worth at this point saying a bit about who might have been the influence on him. So it's been said obviously that the name Challenger may well have been inspired by the Challenger expedition in the 1870s, led by Wyville Thompson, who was one of the faculty at Edinburgh. The other main influence, and this is the one that Conan Doyle mentioned directly, was Professor William Rutherford. And we talked about him when we did the episode on The Creeping Man, episode 25, because he's a possible influence for Presbury too. But in Memories and Adventures, Conan Doyle said, most vividly of all, there stands out in my memory the squat figure of Professor Rutherford with his Assyrian beard, his prodigious voice, his enormous chest, and his singular manner. He fascinated and awed us. I have endeavoured to reproduce some of his peculiarities in the fictitious character of Professor Challenger. And, Rutherford himself was a very difficult person. He ended up having a scandal late in life when he fell out with his senior assistant, and who resigned in protest. And then the students didn't want Rutherford around anymore. And later, Conan Doyle said that he was also a rather ruthless vivisector.
Again, like with so much of Doyle's fiction, it is suffused with his Edinburgh days.
Yeah.
And Challenger is obviously he's a vessel who contains many of Doyle's tutors. He is of a type which even at that time is seen as vanishing.
Yes,
but they're still letting in the still allowing characters.
Yes,
of this type, and this is Doyle's tribute, I think, in that, to his own medical student days and the impressions that these people made on him. And I think it is I mean, obviously we know with Joe Bell and Sherlock Holmes, but with this, I think the Challenger name, that reference to the Challenger expedition, which is it's got to be there.
Yeah,
with Wyville Thompson, there's another of his tutors referenced in a sideways style. But also, I mean, with the name Challenger, I think you've also got to look at the fact that it's a symbolic name. Challenger.
Yes,
That's exactly
absolutely
what he does. What it says on the tin. It is that. I think that's the first and foremost function of the name.
Yes,
it sums him up. So I think all that is going into the mix here. With Challenger.
Yeah, the other couple of people who've been suggested, and I think they're good shouts actually. One of them is George Turnavine Budd.
Oh yes, definitely.
His old business partner of 6 weeks, who was described as being a kind of part charlatan, part genius. And the other person who we'll get to in a bit more detail in a second, but is worth mentioning here is E. Ray Lancaster. And in the annotated edition I mentioned earlier by Pilot and Roden, they quote the obituary of Lancaster, which I think is very striking. Lancaster was a man of strong feeling, which he did not hesitate to express. Any form of sham, fraud, or injustice roused his anger, and his impetuous temperament sometimes led him into difficulties, even injured his worldly prospects. He hated carelessness or sloth, and at times his anger was terrible. His hatred of imposture seemed to be a kind of religious fervour, and he would act without regard to a fear of consequences. His public-spirited zeal in these matters naturally led to rancour and abuse from the friends and supporters of those whom he exposed. He never fought for the love of battle,
Mm.
etc., etc. This sounds exactly like the character that we're seeing depicted here.
Mm. I mean, and we've got that to come back to a previous point with that again, this mix of with I definitely do think the George Turnavine Budd observation is correct. That
Yeah.
there's I mean, we know Doyle used him for other fiction, most notably the Stark Munro letters, where he called him Cullingworth. But what you've got here, where you've just described about Lancaster, he never fought for the love of battle, whereas Challenger does. He enjoys a fight for its own sake. I feel he just enjoys and that's Budd.
Yes.
Budd just enjoyed fighting for its own sake, both in terms of intellectual argument and actual fighting. And you've also got the element with Budd and Cullingworth, and then Challenger. They're kind of always getting police court business.
Yes.
Also comes into that element, which Conan Doyle always enjoys using that for comic effect.
Yes. In fact, Challenger knows the price of the fines of the journalists he's sent down the stairs, which is a very funny little detail.
Yeah, and his wife's almost ready with the money every time.
That's right, yes. So we're into the fourth chapter, and now Malone sort of earns his spurs, doesn't he? And that when the policeman comes and notices that they're sprawled on the floor outside of Challenger's house, Malone admits that it was his fault because he was pretending he wasn't a journalist, and that enamors him to Challenger, who then decides to bring him inside his house and to tell him more about actually what he discovered in South America, and he succeeds in that course of this chapter in really convincing Malone that there is more to him than the fraudster that he's been painted by both McArdle and Tarp Henry. And at the beginning of this chapter, we get another appearance by Jessie Challenger, who this time, unfortunately, is put on the stool of penance for her cheek. I mean, my goodness, you couldn't get away with this in a story today. Although I did think it's interesting how a squat Challenger can put a woman on a 7-foot stool. I think Conan Doyle's forgotten that he's short at this point, but
presumably his arms are long.
Yeah, well, yes, it could be knuckle dragger. But yes, it's one of those things where it hasn't dated terribly well. That Challenger refers to this as frivolous family badinage and little domestic pleasantries. But that aside, but yes, we now get into this into really the exchanges between Malone and Challenger, and there are a couple of things here that really come out of it. One of them is this interesting commentary on Malone's Irishness, which struck me. Challenger is looking at Malone with the scientist's eye and says, "Round-headed," he muttered, "brachycephalic, grey-eyed, black-haired, with suggestion of the negroid. Celtic, I presume." "I am an Irishman, sir." Irish? "Yes, sir. That, of course, explains it." And it's a peculiar thing for somebody of Irish descent to have put into the middle of this novel.
It's also an observation on the time with that phrase in particular, Irish, i.e. not Anglo-Irish.
Yes. Yeah.
You're obviously meant to think Challenger is looking at it from a more scientific perspective, but there is that element of, and don't forget, this is the importance of Challenger being from Largs, where you've got that Catholic Protestant divide that's come over from Ireland. So that's possibly that aspect of kind of cultural assumption coming from Challenger, as well as summing Malone up in a more straightforward, just his physiognomy.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going into that, and this obviously Doyle's own background as a Scots Irishman who then wants to be an Englishman. So it's you're getting that mix all thrown in here.
Yeah, you also get. It's worth saying at this point, you also get that unfortunate use of the term negroid, which we get this a fair few times in The Lost World. And it's just worth pointing it out that it is there. It is something that we're not going to paper over.
It's the scientific language of the time, and unfortunately.
Yeah, and so we get it is something that for modern readers reading it, it will offend, I think.
So after Challenger's assessment of Malone, he then brings him into his confidence about this whole South American adventure that he's been on. And the origins of it seem to be that Challenger he was exploring that region, and he has rudimentary medical skills which have been of use amongst the native population.
Yeah.
And he's brought at one point to give medical help to somebody who he assumes is going to be one of the indigenous people.
Yeah.
But it's another white man, and who is actually Challenger's too late. But he goes through the man's effects, finds out he's actually an American called Maple White, who has found some very interesting things further on. And he's left a sketchbook. He's an artist who's left a sketchbook, which shows some very very interesting survivals. And Challenger is very taken with this and explores further, and he keeps some of these effects of Maple White. This whole setup. I mean, this is classic adventure story stuff, but I think again we could go back as a more direct influence, King Solomon's Mines, where the whole thing begins with a dying man, Jose Silvestre, who comes into the camp, as it were, bringing a map and writings and directions to King Solomon's Mines, and then the English adventurers, it starts them up and they follow the map.
Yeah.
And this is essentially in a slightly different form what's going on here.
Yeah. Yeah, there's and we also get a hint in this section about some of the other kind of real world influences on this as well. Challenger says that his investigation started 2 years ago when he was, I get the sense he's almost checking the discoveries of Wallace and Bates. That's Alfred Russel Wallace and Henry Walter Bates, who is a very good book. I think it's by John Hemming, called Naturalists in Paradise, which is about a group, the whole group that went off in, I think, about the 1840s. And he's drawing on that influence as well as obviously reflecting what Rider Haggard has done previously. And when Challenger was describing that earlier expedition, he does have an interesting phrase where he says the natives were Kukama Indians, an amiable but degraded race with mental powers hardly superior to the average Londoner, which I think is it goes to show that there are different ways in which you can read this story. This is not being derogatory about the natives. It's about derogatory about everybody who's all subhuman as far as Challenger is concerned. But then Challenger then starts to take Malone through the drawings that are in Maple White's book and brings down this important volume off the shelf to sort of corroborate what's in there.
Yeah, the volume is we're back to Edwin Ray Lancaster here. It's his book Extinct Animals, which was published in 1905, and it's quite clear, this was a kind of Bible for Conan Doyle. Doing this story. I mean, I've the first edition copy of this and been going through it. It's a scientific book, obviously aimed at the popular market, or what would be regarded at the time as the educated popular market. And just loaded with the most wonderful illustrations. I mean, one of them in there, there's a photograph of a cast of an iguanodon foot from the Isle of Wight. So this isn't far from Conan Doyle's home, and would match his own iguanodon feet. But there's also a lot of it is there's diagrams and pictures of skeletons and fossils of numerous types. But there are also, this is the imagined way of this beast might have looked. So you go, there's creatures. There's a wonderful one of a woolly mammoth, triceratops. But most relevantly to this, there's picture of a stegosaurus.
Mm.
Its head is extremely bird-like.
Yes.
The artist has been allowed a certain degree of freedom. What's really interesting in this particular picture is you then go to the illustration which appears in the Lost World of Maple White, where he's drawn himself to
Mm.
scale next to this creature, and Conan Doyle's artist has used
Has used it.
the Lancaster one as a model. You can see that quite clearly, and essentially it's looking through the book itself, and you think that this is the birth certificate of the Lost World in a way.
Yes.
It's an absolutely fascinating thing to look through. It's Doyle's tribute to Lancaster. He's doing this all the time in this book, giving tributes to people, giving name checks, and presumably hoping to help Edwin Lancaster's book sales as well.
Yeah, and they were friends, weren't they?
Yeah, they were at this point.
Yeah, that's right. So he would later be very critical of spiritualism, and presumably that tarred the relationship a little bit. But actually, at this time, they were very friendly. This is before Conan Doyle's sort of spiritualist trail, as it were. But and those imagined pictures that are in Lancaster's book, they were then created, weren't they, as physical models in Sydenham Park. I think they're still there to this day, that they were created. And in fact, if anybody's seen the Lucy Worsley documentary, I think you'll see Dan Stashauer is interviewed in the Lost World with the dinosaurs behind as well. But there was another nice little nod, I thought, in that section where Malone gets a real sense of the scale of the Stegosaurus. He says, "Good heavens! Then you think the beast was... Why, Charing Cross Station would hardly make a kennel for such a brute," which I'm sure is a reference to Dickens, don't you think? The opening paragraph of Bleak House, 1852, "As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill." It's a lovely little description. I'm sure that's a nod.
And it also that quote has been used for the purpose of showing how popular dinosaurs have ever been. As soon as dinosaurs appear, they enter pop culture.
That's right.
Because people love them. And again, with this book, The Lost World, Conan Doyle surely knows he's onto a winner, because it's about dinosaurs.
It's about dinosaurs. Yeah. So Malone comes out of his encounter with Challenger absolutely convinced that Challenger is not a fraud, and goes back to McCardle, who is still insistent on denouncing Challenger, and Tarp Henry, who's still unconvinced as well. But he's going to really get a sense of how Challenger is viewed by attending a lecture that evening, which is one of the main events of the kind of first 6 chapters of the book.
Yeah, it's one of those scenes where Doyle is having a lot of fun again. So you've got this popular science lecture in the, I think it's the Zoological Institute.
Yes.
The main speaker is a kind of almost journalistic scientist, a popularizer.
Yes.
But allowed on the stage at the side is Professor Challenger. So already the atmosphere is going to, his presence is going to help the atmosphere to become very febrile. And you get this build-up beautifully described. And Malone says, "Looking behind me, I could see rows of faces of the familiar medical student type. Apparently the great hospitals had each sent their contingent. The behaviour of the audience at present was good-humoured, but mischievous." So there's trouble in the air. But this is another echo of Edinburgh student days for Doyle. This is the kind of setup he was used to, and he'll have been part of as a medical student. This kind of go along to lectures and cause bother, hoot the lecturers, disrupt proceedings and so on. And that's clearly what's going on here. And this is the sort of atmosphere that Doyle absolutely loves writing about, these sort of events.
Oh yes.
And the whole thing does, of course, once the main speaker begins his lecture and is interrupted constantly, He makes assertions, and from the side of the stage comes question
Mm.
in from beneath Challenger's beard. So yeah, it just builds up with Challenger almost being together with the audience, and just trouble is on the way.
Absolutely, and
Mm.
it's a very funny chapter.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a really it's one of the great joys of the Lost World that it is a very funny book in its
Mm.
in its it is throughout, but actually particularly at this time, and I think Conan Doyle manages to get the balance of drama and adventure and
Mm.
humor and horror really really very well
Mm.
in this bit. But this is an out and out funny sequence to the point where the doctor who turns out to speak first off has got a curly
Mm.
brimmed opera hat. There was a universal query of where did you get that tile?
So
um,
it begins, and he also, I mean, there's an aside in this which many people would say is still relevant today, about where there's a complaint about English
oh
lecturers
yes,
are always inaudible, and he talks about the man giving the introduction speaking to his glass carafe and all this.
yes, it's
Uh,
wonderful.
Anything but the audience. His desk can hear what he's saying, but the audience can't.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
very, very funny. It's very
Mm.
good. I mean, the main event though here is ultimately that Challenger gets to have his say
Mm.
and is picked up on immediately by the veteran professor of comparative anatomy, Professor Summerlee. He rose among the audience, a tall, thin, bitter man with the withered aspect of a theologian. So we get the introduction here of Summerlee, who will be, for the first half of the novel at least, kind of Challenger's nemesis, really.
Mm.
And Summerlee is one of those characters who, he's more of a kind of composite of skeptical scientists. Really, he's the definition of the kind of scientific orthodoxy that you can see Conan Doyle being really frustrated with at this time. He goes right back to some of his views in the 1880s and become much more pronounced in the 10 years, 20 years that follow The Lost World. But
Mm.
it's all wrapped up in the character of Summerlee, who is sort of nitpicky and not prepared to take to give any latitude
Mm.
whatsoever. I think Owen Dudley Edwards suggested that Professors James Spence and Sir Robert Christison at
Mm.
Edinburgh might be the kind of examples. I think they were also anatomy
Mm.
professors too, but he feels much more like, unlike the other characters, which you can almost sort of point to having specific influences.
Mm.
Summerlee feels much more like a kind of composite, I think.
He's a type, and also there is that nice contrast going on there with it being described as looking like a theologian. So
Mm,
he's actually a scientist,
mm,
but he's written to look like one of the men who were the enemies of the scientists within the academic world. He's made to look like one of the dons in holy orders.
exactly. Yeah,
So
exactly
there's
right.
again that lovely dichotomy going on.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
there is, and because that's, I mean, one of the things that is the undercurrent of the Lost World generally is that
Mm.
in Conan Doyle's view, science is founded as much on belief as it is on fact,
Mm.
and if you don't fit within the narrative of received wisdom, you're not going to be believed, and that's why
Mm.
Challenger is getting heckled on the stage at the Zoological
Mm.
Institute, and so it's at this point that Challenger says, right, well, I'll prove my case. Invites Summerlee to join him in South America and seeks volunteers. Malone obviously recognizes this as the quest that will land him Gladys at the end of the day. But we also get introduced to another tall, thin man with dark, gingery hair,
Mm.
a few seats in front of Malone, who was also upon his feet, and he glares back at Malone with hard, angry eyes when it looks like Malone is going to get the last seat on this expedition. And this is our first encounter with the rather wonderful character of Lord John Roxton, who we then really get to spend time with in the next chapter.
Mm.
And Roxton invites Malone back to his pad at Albany on Piccadilly. There's a wonderful scene where he suggests that he needs Malone's help to deal with a rather curmudgeonly old soldier upstairs who needs to be force fed but is guarding his door with a rifle. and when Malone says, "Yes, I'll help you rush this old
Mm.
soldier," Roxton reveals, actually, I don't need your help. I sorted it out this morning. He was just testing Malone's bravery, which is a lovely little detail and gets you straight into Lord John's mindset, but also into his place of residence.
Yeah, because he's got an apartment in that famous aristocratic rookery, as it's been termed, Albany, which is sometimes called the Albany, but Albany being the more accurate term. And it's a building on Piccadilly, just separated into essentially luxury apartments for
Mm.
very rich men. It's basically kind of bachelor pads,
Yes.
essentially, and it features. Doyle will have been fully conversant with this, and of course his brother-in-law placed A.J. Raffles
Yes.
in with apartments in the Albany. So it's the ideal place to put Roxton. Roxton is the real sort of aristocratic great white hunter type,
Yes.
who his rooms at the Albany are his little den when he's not out and about round the world shooting things.
Yes.
Or as we also find out with this, when I was the flail of the Lord, we find out that he's been out. He's familiar with South America because he's been out there fighting his own private war against slavers, and this is where we get one of the influences on Roxton, which is Sir Roger Casement,
Yeah.
who we've mentioned before. Was one of the two main agitators in the fighting for reform in the Congo. He'd been a British consul in Africa, and that's where he'd teamed up with Edie Morel to start a campaign to try and end the horrors that were going on under King Leopold's regime. And then he also Casement through this got himself a name as a man who can get things done. And so he was sent out to South America to look at rubber plantations there. But there's also all these issues of various other wrongs that were going on there, and this is what Roxton is there to reflect. He's gone out there, but Roxton is not in any way, shape, or form a government agent. He starts he's a gentleman adventurer who decides to start his own private war against what he sees as a wrong.
That's right.
And so that's his knowledge of South America comes from that, and that's why he really wants to go back on this expedition.
There is a rather wonderful phrase which sort of sums up exactly that kind of gentleman adventurer type. He says, there are times, young fella, when every one of us must make a stand for human right and justice, or you never feel clean again.
So he's the other thing that you've emphasized there as well. He's given this speech pattern.
Yeah.
Which basically is almost that of a cavalry officer.
Yes, it is.
Which of course fits in with some of his fellow residents at Albany. And we do, we get a description of Lord John's rooms, and it's very much it's lit with, I think that the lights have red shades which lend his rooms a ruddy glow, or a pink glow.
Pink radiance.
Pink radiance is, yes, wonderful phrase. And we find he has on the walls pictures of ballerinas and horses, amongst and boxers, of course. So it's this usual mix. But he's also got pictures by the French artist Girodet, who was a student of David, who was one of the great painters of the Napoleonic and Romantic era. And Girodet specialized either portraits of the personalities of his time. So he did famous portraits of Napoleon's great doctor, Dominique Jeanneret. He did the famous portrait of Chateaubriand, Hortense, Josephine's daughter. But he also did classical scenes. Some of those are perhaps less successful, and we don't actually know which of his pictures Lord John's got, or whether he chooses the classical stuff or the kind of the more Orientalist or portrait style pictures, but we've got that in the mix. And then he also has Fragonard is the other
Yeah.
artist who's specifically mentioned. And Fragonard was very unfashionable at the time The Lost World was written. And his pictures are very sort of frou-frou rococo.
Mm.
Lots of frills and pinks
Yes.
and very sort of 18th century aristos at play. His most famous painting is The Swing, which shows a lady in a big pink dress being pushed playfully on a swing by her aging husband, whilst unknown to the aging husband, a young man is watching her as she swings over him and enjoying the view. So we don't know whether whether it's an original Fragonard or whether it might be a print of that particular picture. But it's a curious mix
Yeah.
that we've got in. And of course, the place is loaded with guns,
Yes.
guns and heads.
Guns and heads.
So we have this description of almost a dado rail made of trophy heads. One of which is a rare rhinoceros. Well, of course, it's rare if people like Lord John are around killing them.
Yes, that's right.
But Roxton excuses himself by saying, if you're 10 yards nearer, it would have been my head gracing his house.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So we've got all that mixed in. So he's a curious mix of a character. He's very different from the kind of the really masculine adventurers and hunters that you'll get in a Haggard book.
Well, yeah, and this is the really interesting thing I think about the way Roxton is presented, and I don't know how much this is deliberate by Conan Doyle or it's just modern sensibility reading into it. But there's a lot of explicit statement of masculinity here. So I had this is Malone's description of Albany. I had a general impression of extraordinary comfort and elegance combined with an atmosphere of masculine virility. And then later you have, obviously Roxton is an all-round sportsman and athlete. He's an old Oxonian and Leander man. He's loaded with these with an arsenal. He also says, he recognizes Malone as being a chap who is about to get his rugby cap for Ireland. I never miss a rugby match if I can help it, for it is the manliest game we have left. And, it almost feels like protesting too much. You could easily do an alternative reading of this, that John Roxton is gay, and play it out, and it would work.
But to balance that, I would also point out, I think one of the influences on certainly this part of Lord John Roxton is Ouida's novel, Under Two Flags.
Oh,
Which
yes.
was published in 1867. And the hero of that is the Honourable Bertie Cecil, Beauty Cecil, as it's called, who also has rooms at Albany. And he's an officer in the household cavalry. And his main interests in life seem to be horses and racing. But his rooms are described in almost a similar way to what Doyle's saying about Roxton. And you've got here, when Ouida's talking about his rooms, a guardsman at home is always, if anything, rather more luxuriously accommodated than a young duchess. And Bertie Cecil was never behind his fellows in anything. Besides, he was one of the cracks of the household, and women sent him pretty things enough to fill the Palais Royal. The dressing table was littered with Bohemian glass and gold-stoppered bottles, and all the perfumes of Araby represented by Breidenbach and Rimmel. And this is in a household cavalry officer's home, a bachelor pad. So Roxton is definitely in that tradition. So it's difficult for us to read from this perspective because we don't actually have a bodily equivalent of these characters.
No, we don't.
They
true.
don't exist. So there is this kind of Roxton is obviously very louche.
Yeah.
Very, very laid back, and he has this young fella, my lad, way of speaking, and very, very sort of, as I said, British cavalry officer sort of outlook. But we know he's got this brutal side to him because he's put down the slavers and shot God knows how many animals.
Yeah, and the other thing that comes out with Roxton is his boredom with kind of metropolitan life. And, he's this kind of restless spirit. He always wants to be on the edge of discovery, and that's another theme that we get set up here as well. I mean, this is, in a way, it reflects Gladys's point of view of being, wanting somebody who's not mundane,
Mm.
but also that point that Conan Doyle was making about the blank spaces in the map being filled in, and where's the
Mm.
romance and adventure. There's a wonderful line from Roxton, which is, "We're all getting a deal too soft and dull and comfy. Give me the great wastelands and the wide spaces, with a gun in my fist and something to look for that's worth finding. I've tried war and steeplechasing and aeroplanes, but this hunting of beasts that look like a lobster supper is a brand new sensation." He chuckled with glee at the prospect.
Yes, and alongside this kind of almost restless adventurism, there is this one of Conan Doyle's concerns, which he'd had, probably since the time of his service in the Boer War, about the standards of British preparedness,
Oh, yes.
for war and military service. And you get this with Roxton, the severely practical side of Roxton. It says because he knows South America, and he knows exactly what they're going to be walking into.
Mm.
He says to Malone, "Can you shoot?" "About average territorial standard." "Good Lord, as bad as that? It's the last thing you young fellas think of learning. You're all bees without stings as far as looking after the hive goes. You look silly some of these days when someone comes along and sneaks the honey." And this is Doyle speaking through the mouthpiece
Yeah.
of Roxton, because Doyle was a great advocate of every town should have its own rifle range and shooting school.
Yes.
And we should have a territorial force prepared to back up the regulars. And here we're speaking 2 years before the outbreak of the First World War.
Yeah.
So Doyle has actually been advocating this for over a decade at this point, and just uses Roxton as a mouthpiece, to voice these concerns.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
I wonder if there's also something of Percy Henry Fawcett in Roxton.
Oh, I'd definitely say so, with this kind of different perspectives, because Fawcett is more the explorer,
Yeah.
whereas Roxton is it's the adventure and the hunt, the adventure and the hunting that
Yeah,
he
that's
enjoys.
right.
But certainly that military type, and the restlessness.
Yeah, and both Fawcett and Casement actually are similar in appearance. Over 6 feet tall, grey
Mm,
eyes, beard, strong, athletic. Fawcett himself, I think he made 7 expeditions
mm.
down in South America,
And then disappears.
and then disappeared, didn't he? Disappeared in
Mm,
24, 25,
mm,
never to be seen again. So
mhm.
even more, the ultimate romantic story. But yeah, so that really brings us to the end of chapter 6, and the end, and that's where we're going to pause at the moment, just at the point where our team of would-be adventurers have all been brought together and are about to set out for South America.
But what I tend to forget is that Challenger isn't with them at this.
No, he's not.
Challenger's stood on the dockside, waving them off.
Mm. So you are left with a little bit of a suspicion. Is this possibly a big trick at the end of it?
Mm-mm.
But presumably not, because we've got 2/3 of a novel left to go.
Yes.
So, and that's what we'll be returning to in a future episode of the podcast.
Mm.
So next time we hope to have an interview guest joining us, and then we should be returning to the Lost World early in the new year. But until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. Hooray! And we have now expunged Twitter.
Bye-bye, Elon.
Goodbye.